Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to try my very best to keep you going until the coffee break. I haven't got any smells, sadly, to hand around, which normally I do, but I couldn't fit them in my case, so I apologise for that. What I'm going to be talking about is our work on the Smell and the City project at the University of Manchester, which I lead. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit kind of where I come from within it, because I come from a very different direction than many of the presentations we've heard today. So effectively, I come from the sector around urban design and architecture. I'm a specialist, and my PhD was in the role of the sense of smell in urban design, and how urban designers and architects can start to think about the sense of smell. So I'll explain a little bit about that. Then briefly some of the issues we had around assessing and recording smell. Many of the things we've talked about today, and the presentations have touched on this, but the things that we had to try and deal with in the work that we were doing. Okay, tell you a little bit about the Smell and the City project, and give you kind of, for those of you that don't know much about the smell mapping world out there, I'll give you a potted quick history about smell mapping projects that have occurred in the past. And then hopefully, if I'm good, there'll be an opportunity for questions. Okay, so why the need for sensory urbanism? Well, we kind of look at all these environments, and the sense of smell has an important role in these, all about how we think about the fairground. We think about how we our smells in a fairground, the smells that we associate with that, smells in these kind of natural environments, the wood, etc. The Spanish Steps, and how we associate different smells with these. And when we actually think about cities, actually the smells we often associate them with them are kind of pollution. In my research, when I've asked people what smells do you associate with cities, it's usually pollution, rubbish, waste, food smells, coffee maybe. So it's actually thinking about the role that the sense of smell has in our environmental experience when we think about city environments, and then how designers and architects can take that knowledge and apply it to their practice. So thinking about markets, thinking about smoking legislation and how that's impacted upon our smell experiences of the city, etc. And kind of some of the theory around this, I mean, Sennett argued that modern architects and urban designers had somehow lost an active connection to the human body in their design. And this is true, this backed up by lots of different studies, and particularly in the modernist time, that we've kind of forgotten about smell. It's not something that we can easily apply within our drawing that we do within architecture and urban design. So it's thinking about that and how we apply it. And Ivan Illich said in 1985 that increasingly the whole world has come to smell alike. Gasoline, detergents, plumbing and junk foods coalesce into the Catholic smog of our age. But as Hervé Eleanor suggests, actually the sense of smell falls in what we call the dark side of architecture. These places do have smells, do have odours, these urban spaces and these buildings that we develop. But actually they come about as an unforeseen consequence. They don't come about as something that we plan. So in my work, I try to advocate the approach where we wrestle and tackle with smell, and think about some of the things that actually, the issues that raises for us, such as smell manipulation, etc. Now, I've identified in my work 4 kind of processes that occur within the urban environment in terms of how we manage and design urban environments. I actually used to manage towns and cities in kind of my previous career before academia. And a lot of these kind of ring true, that we had the separation of the smelly industries. We used to, in the 1850s, medieval towns, have smelly industries cheek by jowl with kind of residential properties. But increasingly, they were separated from towns and cities. And then the displacement of odours as well, when we think about ventilation, moving kitchen odours into the kind of back alleyways. And I take people on smell walks around things like the Chinatown back alleyways, and we see what smells we can detect. The deodorisation of cities, I mean, you saw from those previous quotes, a lot of the theory has been that towns and cities have become increasingly sterile places apart from the pollution because we've been washing everything away. And certainly this holds true in some areas more than others. And then masking, you know, the use of odours actually overlaying other odours. And increasingly, I mean, within our towns and cities, pollution is the key smell that's overlaying some of those other odours and actually destroying the smells as they travel through the air. And then finally scenting, and this is kind of my interest here today and also relating to our smell map, is how actually is scenting used in the city? How can it be used in the city? Are some areas more appropriate for scenting to be used than others? And that's certainly what I argue. And so within my work, I explore how the built environment actually shapes the way that wind moves through the streets, how the temperature kind of increases in some areas depending on their design, and how that impacts on smell experiences. Thinking about actually breaking down the urban smellscape into like a perfume. You know, we think of the high notes of a perfume, the smells that we immediately detect and then they kind of disappear after 5 minutes. Those kind of heart notes, the middle level notes, and then the wider smellscape. So thinking about the city-wide smellscape being the kind of the macro level smellscape. There's kind of, you know, if you get a factory and the smell around the factory becoming the heart notes, the neighbourhood notes, and then the local kind of, you know, a car driving past, a flower growing in the street, etc. Okay, so moving on to this quickly, onto assessing and recording smell and how we've thought about that in our work. Well, clearly, as we've touched upon today, you know, there are different classification systems. They apply to wine, they apply to coffee, they apply to food, and there's different ones applying to cities as well. So it was very hard for us to think about that within our work. Smells are difficult to identify and describe, and they're very difficult to record. But I'm counting on you lot to actually come up with this tech and continue developing it, so that makes our lives a lot easier. And then perception, this issue of detection in terms of age, gender, health, smoking habits, the cognition in terms of individual, social and cultural experiences. And I've run large-scale smell surveys about people's smell preferences, and clearly they vary significantly, not just in terms of the smell that we detect, but also the trigeminal stimulation as well, which is something I'm very interested in my work. And the impact of environmental factors as well, the pollution, etc., that I've talked about, and the shape of the street. Restorative environments, this idea of kind of having environments within the city that we can go to and have a relief from the stresses and strains of city life. All the work that's actually been carried out in that field has been very much focused on looking at a tree. How does a view of nature make us feel better? And actually, some recent studies are starting to emerge, one of which was in my PhD, around actually the role of smell within giving us that respite from city life. And then dealing with issues of habituation and adaptation as well. And then our ability to notice smells. I mean, necessarily, you know, we're breathing in and out, day in, day out. It's necessary that we switch off from those smells in many cases, and unless they particularly pose as a danger and those kinds of things. But actually, what I do in my work is say to people, right, we're going to go on a smell walk around the city, and I want to know what smells you can actually detect, because I think this is one of the reasons that we undervalue smell, is because we switch it off. And the smells are actually playing an important part of our life, and as many of you all know, it's not often until people lose a sense of smell that they start to appreciate that. So there's commonly used methods in assessing smell environments. Now, when I talk about smelling the environment, I purposely don't talk about environmental odours, because when you talk about environmental odours, I think people immediately start thinking about wastewater plants and those notorious bad smells that people want to try and get rid of and remove from town and city centres, and that's not what my work's about, really, at all. But legislation, harmful and nuisance odours and monitoring of those. And the human sense of smell, as we've heard today, is far more sensitive than many of these other things. What we actually do with smell information is far more sophisticated than, say, what a dog would do with it, even though they're far more sensitive in terms of what they can actually detect. The sniff panels that have traditionally been used, headspace, computer modelling, and the list goes on. And the rise of the augmented nose. I just love the way that looks. I mean, so to design with smell, we must make it visible. And this is where our Smell and the City project has been kind of wrestling with some of those issues around that. And that's the address of the blog. But if you just Google Smell and the City, that'll come up. And also we're on Twitter at Victoria Henshaw as well. That's all one word. So the Smell and the City project, some of the activities that we've undertaken as part of that. Well, the project team, it includes myself, urban designer, we've got geographers, cartographers, people from the business school, marketeers that are in there as well. And we've held all sorts of different activities. We had a workshop that was on Smell and the City that was for both professionals and academics and students, where we started to tease out some of the issues around relationships between smell and the city, both the smells that we detect, but what smells we associate with different cities and how they help us to kind of remember, take us back across space and time to different places as well. We've also had a workshop on representing smell. How can we go about in doing that? It's notoriously difficult without the actual access to the perfume ingredients. So we've had all sorts of things like getting traditional products from the shop and putting those into different pots and testing those on the street and interviewing people. And we've got videos on YouTube of that if anyone's interested. We've also, most importantly, had these smell walks, and I've undertaken lots of those. In my PhD research, I undertook smell walks in English cities. I also went into Grasse, a perfume production centre of the world, and smell walked around there. And within the traditional town centre of Doncaster in the north of England, if anyone knows it, I did 52 smell walks with 52 individuals where I interviewed them and stopped in certain places and asked them what smells they could detect, what they thought about them, what they thought about the place and all their memories, and explored the relationships between smell perception and place perception, and also explored how people's perceptions of different smells differed according to the environment within which they were stood. So here's some pictures of kind of the Montreal smell walk. There we go, on a lovely sunny day last September. And these are the kind of things at that point we were asking people. And this kind of knowledge was then transferred over into the smell map. All this data collected is being inputted into that. So we asked people the name of the smell that they detected and to give it a description so we could explore some of those words that are coming up. So do they describe it as lemon, or do they describe it as citrusy? All those kinds of things. How do they like it? Their liking rating on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do they like the smell? And we also asked them within the smell map that's online, some further details about themselves. So smell mapping isn't something that's new. Dating back, say, the John Snow's Broad Street, the 1850s, this is one of the key ways that we actually identified the sources of cholera. And many of you will be familiar with this map from the Ghost Map and from the Ghost Map books, where actually the individual cases of cholera were identified. And this relates to smell because prior to this study, people thought it was the deadly miasmas emerging from the ground that were actually poisoning people and making them ill. Pollution and control is something that clearly we consider within mapping, and there's the city of Manchester where the smoke was, and in some cases still is. Here's a psychogeographic map of a Chinatown, and it highlights some of those different smells. And then a friend and colleague of mine, this is her smell of Edinburgh. On a breezy day, so she's actually identified smells that you can detect there, how they move around the city, and she's also recreated those smells which she exhibits all over the place. That's Kate McLean, if anyone's interested in her work. But then clearly the chemical cartography work that you might have seen that is being carried out by the United States Defence at the moment, mapping different smells around the world so they can start to detect when strange smells are there of potentially terrorist nature. And then, of course, mobile apps. And as mobile apps emerge, we've got the stinky maps that appeared, where you can actually decide whether a smell is intoxicating, fragrant, funky, reeks or profane. It's a little bit kind of steering people in different directions there, but interesting nevertheless. Spotting pollution, where I was talking about someone over lunchtime about this one, and actually how do we describe it to try and identify what that actual smell is, as you can see down the side. A smell map that was implemented in Japan. Some of you may have seen this as well. The Smell Club. And then this is our smell map. Now, we'll see whether it actually allows me to is the test site. It's all got to move over to the correct side within the next couple of weeks. But effectively, put that down for a moment so we can steer this. What we can do with this is drop into any area that we want. So if we kind of zoom in here, well, you can see here that it's we've gone into the middle of the green. Okay, but the well, you can see that there's a scent width there. And what it does is it asks people the time it's detected. And that doesn't have to be now. That can be 50 years ago. I was stood here outside the Ritz Hotel and I detected the smell of something, and it can be placed in there, so it allows us to track that. It asks people those other factors, how much do you like the smell, your age, your gender. And the idea is that what we'll be able to do from this is get all that data, and we'll be able to track different perceptions of different smells across space and time, not only back in time in terms of historical smells, but also in terms of in the future as well. When we think about, the smell of lemon, how is that being perceived in different cities around the world? Is it being rated differently? Oh my God, I scared myself then. And is it being rated differently at different times of the evening, daytime, during the different times of the month? All those kinds of different factors we'll be able to get from that data. And so it includes these various different factors that we'll be able to analyse. But in terms of where we go from here and where we go forward with this, well, the site will go live later this month, and that'll be the address. And we're planning to roll this out pretty quickly and collect as much data as we can, because us academics love data. And we're going to crowdsource that. Clearly, this is going to be something that anyone can access. Clearly, we've got a language issue, and that's been faced by some of the previous attempts to map smell. But we're going to be able to track those different descriptions and perceptions. And actually, if you think about some of the applications of this, what we're going to be able to find is that different cities are going to be associated with different smells. Now, in my work, one of those kind of historical polluters of towns and cities, you've had the breweries and the factories and all those kinds of things. It's going to be very interesting to see kind of whether they're fed into this, whether people reflect back on how the city smells and how it smells now differently, all those kinds of things. Okay, so that's me, and time for questions.
Thank you very much. So any question and comment? Any questions?
So you think in the future with digital olfaction you will change all your strategies and it will be different?
Well, I mean, my work around town and city centres and advising architects and urban designers how they may actually adapt this into their practice. What I always argue is it all depends on the place, not only in terms of the city that you're actually thinking about designing, but in terms of the actual environment that you're within and how experimental you can be. So there are things like the smell bus stops. I mean, we have quite a lot of these in the UK now, where we have bus stops that emit smells. We had the McCain's ad back in February last year, had kind of a heated globe that looked like a potato. And when you went up to it, you pressed a button and the voucher came out, and then a smell of bacon jacket potatoes was emitted from the top of the bus stop. Now, actually, I've interviewed people stood at these bus stops and asked them what they thought about them. And generally speaking, the Brits are quite happy about them. They quite like them. It has to be said, it's the novelty factor. Who doesn't like them is the guy who was working next to it with a market stall, who was saying it was giving him a headache. He'd written to his MP, he'd gone to the local council, all those different things. So in terms of kind of our relationship to smell, that's very important. But significantly, these kind of bus stops have been also placed in other parts of the world. In San Francisco, there was one of these smell bus stops was placed there, and it actually was ripped down within 24 hours because of environmental sensitivities. So the idea of what the smell is going to do to us, it's going to set off allergic reactions, and clearly, parts of the States, parts of Canada, Nova Scotia are very aware of these environmental sensitivities. So kind of the political environment within which we detect these smells is really important as well, and fascinating. Interestingly, in San Francisco and the bus stop that was there, not only did they argue the case for allergies and environmental sensitivities, but they also said it would make homeless people hungry, because it was the smell of cookies that was being emitted. So, there's interesting issues and manipulation, the idea of manipulation there as well.
If not, thank you very much.
You're welcome.